The crack of gunfire split the morning air at Quantico Marine Corps Base, each report echoing across the outdoor rifle range, like thunder rolling over distant hills. Metal targets pinged in sequence as copper-jacketed rounds found their marks at 900 yards, the sound delayed by distance and wind. Sergeant Bradley Cassian lowered his M40A6 rifle from his shoulder, the faintest smile pulling at his sun-weathered features as he straightened from his prone position. Around him, 3 other Marine marksmen nodded their approval, their expressions carrying that particular brand of competitive respect found only among those who measure success in millimeters at impossible distances. 920 yards, no wind compensation needed, Bradley announced, patting the rifle's stock with the proprietary affection of a craftsman for his favorite tool. Anyone here think they can beat that? Corporal Indra Sabira stood near the wind flags, her dark hair pulled back in regulation style, arms crossed, as she surveyed the range with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most skilled person in any room. Nobody here has the capability, Bradley. You're holding the base record for a reason. Staff Sergeant Carl Fletcher checked his spotting scope one final time, then glanced toward the small crowd of Marines gathered to watch the morning qualification exercises. Record's been standing for what, 6 months now? Solid shooting, Cassian. But from behind the safety barrier separating observers from active shooters, a voice emerged, soft, almost tentative, nearly swallowed by the autumn breeze sweeping across the Virginia landscape. Mind if I try? The words hung in the air for 3 heartbeats. Then laughter erupted from the gathered Marines. Not cruel exactly, but carrying that particular tone of amused disbelief that comes when someone's request seems so far outside the realm of possibility that mockery becomes almost reflexive. The woman who had spoken stood perhaps 15 feet away, small-framed and unassuming, in a gray cardigan over a white blouse, khaki pants, and practical flats. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no different from 1,000 other administrative workers scattered across the base. No uniform, no visible identification badge, no indication whatsoever that she belonged in the world of precision marksmanship and military excellence unfolding before her. Bradley's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline as his gaze traveled from her sensible shoes to her almost apologetic posture. You serious right now? You even know what this rifle weighs? Hazel, isn't it? Carl stepped forward, his deep voice carrying the professional skepticism of someone who'd spent years teaching marksmanship fundamentals to overconfident recruits. You work over in base operations office. You ever even fired a weapon before? The woman, Hazel apparently, didn't answer immediately. She simply stood there, gray eyes focused not on the Marines themselves, but on the M40A6 rifle still resting against Bradley's shoulder. Something flickered across her face, too quick to identify. In that moment, anyone paying close attention might have noticed the slight shift in her weight distribution, the way her shoulders squared ever so subtly, the unconscious adjustment of her center of gravity. But the observation came and went like morning mist burning off under sunlight. I'd like to try, she repeated, her voice still quiet but carrying an undertone of certainty that didn't quite match her demeanor. The Marines exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them in the way of military personnel who'd worked together long enough to communicate without words. Finally, Lance Corporal Flynn Garnett, younger than the others at 24, with the lean build of someone who spent more time in the armory than the gym, shrugged with theatrical helplessness. Hey, it's a free country, Flynn said, though his smirk suggested he found the situation entertaining rather than inclusive. Maybe we'll get some good material for the group chat. Captain Forrester Arden materialized from the observation platform, his 42 years evident in both his bearing and the weathered creases around his eyes. As range officer, he viewed civilians on his firing line with the same enthusiasm most people reserved for unexpected dental work. His gaze swept over Hazel with clinical assessment, finding her lacking in every metric that mattered to him. Ma'am, this is a military training facility. Do you have authorization to be in this area? I walked over from my office during break, Hazel replied, her hands remaining at her sides, non-threatening, almost deferential. The range was active. I was curious. Forrester's jaw tightened incrementally. Curiosity and marksmanship aren't the same thing. These Marines are conducting qualification exercises for advanced. Let her try. The voice came from near the equipment shed, deeper and more gravelly than the others, carrying the weight of decades rather than years. Master Gunnery Sergeant Oswald Ringy emerged into full view, his 55 years sitting on him like well-worn body armor. His face held the particular stillness of someone who'd seen enough to stop being surprised by anything, coupled with the slight interest of a man who recognized when situations might become memorable. "What's it going to hurt? Maybe we'll all learn something." The statement hung between them, heavy with unspoken implication. Forrester's expression suggested he doubted anyone would learn anything, except perhaps the limits of civilian overconfidence. But he stepped back with a curt nod. In the Marines, when a master gunnery sergeant spoke, even captains listened. Bradley shrugged with exaggerated magnanimity, walking over to Hazel with the rifle held loosely in one hand. He made no move to demonstrate proper handling, explain the safety mechanisms, or offer any of the usual preliminary guidance someone might provide to a novice. Instead, he simply extended the weapon toward her, his expression making clear that he expected entertainment value from her inevitable failure. "Here you go. Try not to shoot yourself." Hazel's fingers closed around the M40A6's receiver, and for just an instant, so brief that only someone specifically watching for it would notice, her hands moved through a sequence, index finger automatically verifying the weapon was on, safe, thumb checking the bolt, eyes performing a quick visual inspection of the chamber. The movements flowed with the unconscious grace of muscle memory, developed over thousands of repetitions, then disappeared as quickly as they had manifested. She lifted the rifle to her shoulder, adjusting her grip with what should have been awkward unfamiliarity, but instead looked disturbingly natural. "Oh, this is going to be good," Indra murmured to Carl, not bothering to lower her voice. "Does she even know which end the bullets come out of?" Near the back of the gathered observers, Private First Class Lily Grace watched with wide eyes, her youth evident in both her posture and her expression. At 22, she'd been in the Marines less than 2 years, and the sight of another woman, especially a civilian, stepping into the aggressive masculine space of competitive marksmanship sparked something like hope in her chest. She wanted to see what happened next, even if part of her feared the outcome would simply confirm what the others seemed to expect. Hazel moved toward the firing line with deliberate steps, her sensible flats crunching against the gravel. She knelt into a shooting position, and again, that flicker of something appeared, shoulders squared at exactly the right angle, spine alignment perfect, breathing pattern already slowing into the controlled rhythm necessary for long-range precision work. The posture held for 2 seconds before she made a show of adjusting awkwardly, as if settling into an unfamiliar position. "You need us to show you how to aim," Indra called out, her tone dripping with the particular condescension that turns helping into humiliation. "There's this thing called a scope. You look through it." Flynn had moved to the spotting scope platform, supposedly to observe Hazel's shot, but actually to make final adjustments to the windage dial. His movements were subtle, practiced, the kind of minor sabotage that wouldn't be noticed by someone unfamiliar with the equipment. He caught Indra's eye and winked. If this civilian somehow managed to hit anything, it wouldn't be because the scope was properly calibrated. Master Gunny Oswald stood 20 feet back from the firing line, arms crossed over his chest, face revealing nothing. His eyes tracked Hazel's movements with the attention of someone reading a language only he understood. The target sat at 500 yards, a distance that separated casual shooters from serious marksmen. Wind flags dotted the range between firing line and target, their movement indicating a variable crosswind of perhaps 8 to 10 miles per hour. For an experienced shooter, manageable. For a supposed civilian taking her first shots, nearly impossible. Hazel's finger rested along the trigger guard, proper placement, not on the trigger itself. Her breathing slowed further, and then, without announcing her intention, without asking for guidance or confirmation, she settled into absolute stillness. The M40A6 roared, recoil driving back against her shoulder. The sound rolled across the range and echoed off the distant tree line. 500 yards downrange, the metal target rang like a bell, dead center. The laughter died. Silence rushed in to fill its absence, heavy and sudden as a thunderclap. Bradley's confident smirk faltered into something approaching confusion. Carl's hand moved unconsciously toward the spotting scope, verifying what his ears had just told him. Flynn straightened from his position, eyes narrowing. "Beginner's luck," Bradley announced after a pause that lasted 2 seconds too long. "Anyone can get lucky once. Try it again." "Before we see what happens next," If you're enjoying this story of hidden strength and unexpected justice, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We post stories like this every single day, tales of underestimated heroes who prove everyone wrong. And if you think Hazel's about to shock these Marines, just wait until you see what happens at the 15-minute mark. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Now, back to the range where things are about to get very interesting. Hazel made no verbal response. She simply cycled the bolt with movements that should have been clumsy, but instead flowed like water, chambering another round with practiced efficiency. The brass casing ejected in a perfect arc, landing on the concrete with a musical ping. This time she adjusted her position slightly, accounting for something in the wind that perhaps only she could detect. The second shot came faster than the first, following a breath cycle that suggested training rather than guesswork. The target sang again, 600 yards this time, and when Carl checked through the spotting scope, his expression tightened into something approaching concern. "The holes overlap," he said slowly, as if speaking the words might make them make sense. That's not normal for someone shooting their first time. Lieutenant Charlotte Erica had been observing from near the equipment shed, her 29 years and officer rank giving her a perspective slightly removed from the competitive dynamics playing out among the enlisted shooters. She moved forward now, sensing the situation shifting into territory that might require someone to de-escalate before egos transformed into actual conflict. "Gentlemen, let's keep this civil," Charlotte suggested, her tone carrying authority without aggression. "She's clearly got some experience. Let her shoot." But Indra stepped forward, arms still crossed, her expression hardening into the particular kind of defensive arrogance that emerges when someone's assumptions about the world start crumbling beneath them. "Okay, 2 lucky shots. Consistency is what separates amateurs from professionals. You can't maintain that at real distances." Flynn moved to adjust the scope again, but Hazel's hand intercepted his, gently but firmly pushing his fingers away from the windage dial. She made her own adjustment, correcting for the sabotage he'd introduced, her movements quick and precise. Flynn's face flushed red as he stepped back, suddenly very interested in examining his boots. Carl frowned, moving to check the scope settings himself. The windage was off by 3 clicks. Who set this? Nobody answered. The question hung in the air like smoke. Hazel settled into position for a third shot. This time, before she fired, Bradley moved closer, close enough that his shadow fell across her, close enough that the gesture carried implicit intimidation. He loomed there, all 6 feet and 200 pounds of him, making clear through physical presence that this space belonged to him and she was here only by his sufferance. "Let me show you how it's really done," Bradley said, reaching for the rifle. "Cassian," Master Gunny Oswald's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Return to your position. Let her shoot." The command was delivered in that particular tone that non-commissioned officers perfect over decades. Not loud, not emotional, but carrying the absolute certainty that it would be obeyed. Bradley's jaw clenched, but he stepped back, his expression suggesting he'd remember this moment and find ways to address it later. Hazel's finger moved to the trigger. The rifle spoke once more, and 700 yards away, the target rang its approval. In the awkward silence that followed, Corporal Connor Blake shifted his weight from one foot to the other. At 27, Connor had already completed 1 tour as a scout sniper himself before transferring to instructional duties, and he was watching Hazel with an expression quite different from the others. Where they saw luck, or perhaps some casual hobby shooting experience, Connor was seeing something else entirely, the way she held the rifle, the rhythm of her breathing, the unconscious habits that marked thousands of hours behind a scope rather than dozens. Something familiar lurked in those movements, something that tugged at his memory without quite breaking surface. "That's 3 for 3, Connor observed quietly, mostly to himself. Gunnery Sergeant Paul Raymond had pulled out his phone, ostensibly to check messages, but actually, if anyone had bothered to notice, positioning the camera to record what was unfolding. In his 38 years, he'd learned that moments like these were worth documenting, even if he wasn't yet sure exactly what kind of moment this was becoming. Speaking of precision equipment, modern professional rifle scopes have evolved far beyond basic magnification. Today's advanced optic systems integrate laser rangefinders, ballistic calculators, and wind sensors directly into the scope housing. These systems can automatically adjust for elevation, windage, and even Coriolis effect at extreme ranges. Military-grade models feature nitrogen purging to prevent internal fogging, multi-coated lenses for superior light transmission in low-visibility conditions, and ruggedized construction rated for thousands of rounds of recoil. For professionals who demand accuracy at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, investing in quality optics isn't optional, it's mission-critical. Bradley grabbed the rifle from Hazel's hands before she could object, his movement sharp enough to almost qualify as aggression. Enough playing around. You've had your fun. This is professional equipment for professional shooters, not civilians who want to play soldier. The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife, and several of the observing Marines shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that their sergeant had crossed from competitive hazing into something uglier. Give her back the rifle. Charlotte's voice carried officer authority now, not suggestion. Bradley, I'm not asking. For a moment, the tableau held. Bradley clutching the M40A6, Charlotte staring him down, Hazel standing silently between them, with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. Then Master Gunny Oswald moved, closing the distance with the measured pace of someone who diffused more confrontations than anyone present could count. Sergeant Cassian, the lieutenant gave you an order. Are we going to have a problem? The question was delivered in conversational tones that somehow made it more threatening than shouting would have been. Bradley's grip on the rifle loosened incrementally, and he extended it back toward Hazel with barely concealed resentment. No problem, Master Gunny. Just making sure equipment is treated properly. Hazel accepted the rifle without comment. For just a moment, her eyes met Oswald's, and something passed between them, not recognition exactly, but perhaps the acknowledgement that he was seeing more than the others, looking deeper than surface assumptions. Carl stepped forward, and his approach carried less naked hostility than Bradley's, but perhaps more danger because of its professional packaging. As a marksmanship instructor, his challenges would come wrapped in technical expertise, questions designed to expose ignorance rather than simply assert dominance. All right, Carl said, his tone reasonable and therefore somehow worse. You can hit stationary targets at intermediate range. That's respectable for a hobbyist. But let's talk about the technical side. You understand ballistic coefficients, minute of angle calculations? How do you adjust for wind drift at varying distances? Hazel's expression remained neutral, but her eyes flicked toward the wind flags almost unconsciously, an automatic assessment that happened faster than conscious thought. Carl caught it, and his frown deepened. The wind's southwest at 12 miles per hour, he continued, pressing his apparent advantage. How much do you compensate for a 700-yard shot? Instead of answering verbally, Hazel simply raised the rifle again, settling into her shooting stance with that same disturbing naturalness. Her gaze swept across the wind flags dotting the range, and Connor, still watching with growing fascination, saw her eyes move through what could only be described as automatic calculation, reading wind speed and direction from the flag's movement, the way others might read words on a page. The shot took 3 seconds from stance to trigger pull. 800 yards downrange, the target rang its approval once more. Holy cow, Lily breathed, the words escaping before she could stop them. Several of the other Marines shifted, their expressions transitioning from amusement to something approaching unease. Bradley's face had gone red, the color creeping up from his collar. This is nonsense. There's no way she's maintaining this by accident. You've shot before. Where? What's your background? Hazel lowered the rifle, checking the chamber with movements that continued to be far too smooth, far too practiced. I've had some experience. Some experience? Indra's voice rose an octave, her composure cracking around the edges. Nobody shoots like this with some experience. Who trained you? What civilian program teaches this level of precision? The questions came faster now, the Marines circling like sharks who'd caught the scent of something they couldn't quite identify. Flynn had retreated to the edge of the group, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the situation he'd helped create. Charlotte maintained her position of neutral observation, but her hand had moved unconsciously toward her radio, as if preparing to call for backup should the situation deteriorate further. Captain Forrester had been standing to one side, watching the interaction with growing concern. Now he moved forward with the deliberate pace of someone asserting authority through measured action rather than raised voices. That's enough, Forrester announced. Ma'am, I need to see identification. I need to verify your authorization to be in this area and your clearance to handle military weapons. Hazel reached slowly into her cardigan pocket, her movements deliberately non-threatening. As she withdrew her wallet, her sleeve rode up slightly on her left forearm, revealing for just a moment what looked like the edge of a scar. Not a simple line from an accident, but a distinctive burn pattern that suggested exposure to explosive forces, the kind of mark that came from being too close to something that detonated. Lily noticed it first, her sharp intake of breath causing Connor to look more closely. He saw the scar, saw the texture of damaged tissue that had healed years ago, and felt something click into place in his memory. That particular injury pattern looked familiar, looked like, "She has a scar," Lily whispered to Connor, but her voice carried further than intended in the sudden tension. Forrester took Hazel's ID card, examining it with the thorough attention of someone trained to spot discrepancies. His frown deepened as he pulled out his phone, presumably to run her information through the base personnel database. Carl moved closer to Hazel, his earlier skepticism transforming into something approaching professional curiosity. "That scar on your arm, how'd you get it?" "Old injury," Hazel replied, her tone offering nothing. "From what?" "Work accident." The non-answer hung between them, simultaneously truthful and completely uninformative. Carl's eyes narrowed, but before he could press further, Forrester's phone chimed with the database search results. "Hazel Blackwood," Forrester read aloud, his voice carrying across the range. "Administrative assistant, base operations office. Previous military service." He paused, scrolling through the information. "Army Reserve, admin specialist, honorable discharge." His tone carried faint disappointment, as if he had been hoping for something more dramatic to justify his suspicions. Bradley laughed, the sound harsh and vindicated. "Ha! Army! Well, no wonder. Army standards are significantly lower than Marines. Explains why she can hit targets at these baby distances." The insult was designed to cut multiple ways at once, dismissing both Hazel's shooting and the entire United States Army in one efficient package. Several of the Marines chuckled, the tension breaking as they settled back into familiar tribal patterns. But Connor wasn't laughing. He was staring at Hazel with an intensity that suggested he was working through a complex problem, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what made sense. "No," he said slowly, his voice cutting through the laughter. "That's not right. The way she holds the rifle, that's not Army technique. That's Marine Scout sniper methodology. The breathing pattern, the stance, even the way she cycles the bolt, that's not something you learn in basic admin training." Indra rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, Connor. You're reading way too much into this. She probably had a boyfriend who was a Marine, learned a few tricks for fun. It's not that deep." But Hazel's expression had shifted. Not much, just the slightest tightening around her eyes, as if Connor's observation had struck closer to something real than the other's dismissals. Master Gunny Oswald had gone very still. He stood with his arms crossed, studying Hazel with an intensity that suggested he was processing information, pulling threads from memory that might or might not connect. His lips moved silently, forming words that didn't reach sound. Blackwood, Helmand Province, 2013. The name and location hung in his mind, triggering associations that felt important but remained frustratingly out of reach. He'd served multiple deployments over his decades in the Corps, had known hundreds of Marines, had heard thousands of names in briefings and after-action reports. Something about this specific combination resonated, but the memory stayed submerged, tantalizingly close to surface but not quite breaking through. "Whatever," Carl said, waving his hand dismissively. "She got lucky with a few shots. Let's see how she handles a real challenge." He gestured toward the equipment shed where several different weapons rested in their racks. "We've got targets set up at 1,200 yards. That's expert level. Even we only hit those maybe half the time under ideal conditions. You want to keep playing? Let's see you work at distance that matters." Hazel's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her gray eyes. Not fear, not exactly excitement, but perhaps the recognition of a threshold being approached. Connor watched her carefully, seeing her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, her breathing pattern shift into something even more controlled. 1,200 yards in this wind?" Charlotte interjected, concern evident in her tone. "Carl, that's excessive. She's already demonstrated competence. There's no need to—" "She wants to shoot, let her shoot," Bradley interrupted, his voice carrying renewed confidence. 1,200 yards separates civilians playing around from professionals who actually know what they're doing. "I want to see this." The challenge had been issued, and now all eyes turned to Hazel. She stood there in her gray cardigan and sensible flats, looking like someone who'd wandered away from a PTA meeting, facing down a group of elite Marine marksmen who'd just raised the stakes to a level that would challenge even their own abilities. Slowly, deliberately, Hazel nodded. Carl's smile held sharp edges. Excellent. Let's make this interesting. We'll use the Barrett M82, 50 caliber. Recoil alone will probably knock you on your back if you don't know how to handle it. The rifle weighs 30 pounds unloaded. Think you can manage? The Barrett M82 was less a rifle and more a statement of intent, a weapon designed for engaging light vehicles and materiel targets at extreme range, co-opted by military snipers for its ability to deliver devastating precision across distances that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible. The recoil was legendary, the report loud enough to require hearing protection, the learning curve steep enough that even experienced shooters needed time to master its particular demands. Flynn brought the Barrett from the equipment shed with visible effort, the weapon's bulk evident even in his trained hands. He set it on the shooting bench with exaggerated care, then stepped back with a smirk that suggested he was already anticipating Hazel's failure. "Good luck," Flynn said, the words containing no actual wishes for success. "Try not to break your shoulder." Hazel approached the Barrett with measured steps. Her hands reached for the rifle, and again, for anyone watching closely enough, there came that flash of too smooth familiarity. She lifted the weapon, checking its balance, running through safety checks with movements that shouldn't have been so automatic for someone supposedly unfamiliar with the platform. Connor's eyes widened fractionally. She's done this before. That's not someone picking up a Barrett for the first time. Look at how she's checking the gas system, verifying the recoil spring. Those are specific maintenance checks that, "Oh, give it a rest," Indra snapped, but her voice carried less certainty than before. "You're seeing patterns that aren't there." Master Gunny Oswald moved closer, his position now offering an unobstructed view of Hazel's movements. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes tracked every gesture, every unconscious adjustment, cataloging details with the precision of someone trained to notice what others missed. The wind had picked up, flags now indicating gusts approaching 15 miles per hour from the southwest. Clouds scudded across the morning sky, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow across the range. The conditions were challenging even for expert shooters, the kind of variables that turned precision marksmanship from science into art. Hazel settled into position behind the Barrett, adjusting the bipod height with quick efficiency. She pressed her cheek to the stock, eye finding the scope, body alignment shifting into configurations that suggested countless hours in exactly this position. Her breathing slowed further, deeper, settling into a rhythm that made Carl's eyes narrow with recognition. "That's Hellman breathing technique," Connor said suddenly, his voice sharp with certainty. "That specific pattern, 4 count in, 7 count hold, 8 count exhale, that's what scout snipers use for extreme distance shots in high-stress environments. That's not recreational shooting methodology, that's combat-tested protocol." Bradley started to respond, irritation clear in his posture, but the words died unspoken as Hazel's finger moved to the trigger. The entire range seemed to hold its breath, Marines frozen in positions of skeptical attention, watching a woman in a cardigan prepare to attempt a shot that would challenge their own abilities. The Barrett roared. The sound was immense, primal, a concussive wave that rolled across the range and echoed off the distant tree line. The rifle's recoil was substantial enough to make the shooting bench jump, the kind of force that inexperienced shooters found intimidating and even experienced marksmen treated with respect. Hazel absorbed the recoil perfectly, her body position and muscle control evidencing training that had been repeated until it became reflexive. She didn't flinch, didn't lose her sight picture, didn't demonstrate any of the reactions someone supposedly unfamiliar with the platform would show. For 5 long seconds, everyone watched downrange through binoculars and spotting scopes, waiting for the sound of impact to make its way back across 1,200 yards of Virginia landscape. Then Paul's voice cut through the silence, sharp with disbelief. "Bullseye, 1,200 yards, dead center, what the—" He caught himself, professional discipline overriding his shock. "That's a perfect hit." The Marines stood frozen, expressions ranging from confusion to outright shock. Phones came out now, multiple Marines recording, documenting something that had just crossed from amusing distraction into territory none of them quite understood. Bradley's face had gone from red to pale, his eyes locked on the distant target as if staring hard enough might change what had just happened. Indra's phone slipped from her fingers, the case shattering against the concrete range floor in a spray of plastic and glass. She didn't even notice, too fixated on the impossible shot she'd just witnessed. Carl's professional composure cracked, his careful skepticism giving way to something approaching awe. He moved to verify the shot himself, checking and rechecking through the spotting scope, as if his eyes might be lying to him. Captain Forrester stood rigid, his hand moving unconsciously toward his phone, preparing to make calls that might explain what was happening on his range. And Master Gunny Oswald, his expression had transformed from neutral observation into dawning recognition, memory fragments finally clicking into place, forming a picture that made his breath catch in his chest. Bradley recovered first, driven by the particular desperation of someone whose worldview was actively collapsing. He closed the distance to Hazel in 3 aggressive strides, his hand reaching for her shoulder, with force that crossed firmly into physical confrontation. "Who are you really?" Bradley demanded, his fingers digging into her shoulder hard enough to make Hazel wince. "No civilian shoots like this. I don't care what your ID says. Tell me the truth." The touch was aggressive enough that Charlotte started forward, hand moving toward her radio to call military police. Connor moved as well, positioning himself to intervene if the situation escalated further. But in Bradley's desperation to get answers, his grip pulled at Hazel's cardigan, the fabric stretching, and then rip. The sound was soft but definitive. The cardigan's shoulder seam gave way, and as Bradley's hand continued its motion, the torn fabric pulled down Hazel's left arm, exposing her shoulder beneath the white blouse. And there, rendered in black ink across her deltoid muscle, was an image that made every Marine present freeze as if someone had pressed pause on reality itself. The tattoo was distinctive, unmistakable, a skull with hollow eyes, crosshairs precisely centered where the nose would be, the entire image surrounding and incorporating a rifle scope reticle. This was the hog's tooth, the sacred symbol of Marine Corps scout snipers, worn only by those who had completed one of the most grueling training pipelines in American military history. Below the skull, in precise military stencil font, 0317, the MOS code, Military Occupational Specialty, Scout Sniper. Below that, Helmand, 2013-2014. The deployment location and dates, marking time spent in one of the most hostile operational environments of the Afghan War. 3 seconds of absolute silence followed, heavy as stone, crushing as depth pressure. Then Lily gasped, the sound sharp and involuntary, her hand flying to her mouth even as tears began forming in her eyes. "Oh my God!" Master Gunnery Sergeant Oswald's entire body snapped to attention with the sharp precision of muscle memory honed over 3 decades. His right hand came up in a salute that was absolutely parade ground perfect, held with the kind of respect reserved for fallen comrades and Medal of Honor recipients. "Sergeant!" The word exploded from Oswald with such force that several Marines physically jerked in surprise. His voice cracked with emotion he hadn't shown in years, decades of professional detachment shattering against something that cut through every layer of military bearing. The single word hung in the air like a gong strike, reverberating through consciousness and changing everything. Because that tattoo wasn't something anyone could simply acquire. It wasn't decorative art chosen from a shop wall. The hog's tooth was earned through blood, sweat, psychological torment, and the successful completion of training designed to break all but the most exceptional candidates. It marked membership in one of the most elite fraternities in the American military. And the MOS code, 0317, confirmed what the image declared. Scout Sniper, the Marines who operated in 2-person teams at extreme range, who spent days in hostile territory calling precision fire onto enemy positions, who measured their success in millimeters and minutes of angle across distances measured in miles. Bradley stumbled backward as if physically struck, his hand releasing Hazel's shoulder, his face draining of color until he looked genuinely ill. His mouth opened and closed twice without producing sound, words failing in the face of comprehension too large to process. Indra stood completely frozen, her shattered phone forgotten on the concrete, both hands now pressed against her mouth, as if physically holding back the words that wanted to escape. Tears tracked down her cheeks, though whether from shock or shame or something else entirely was impossible to determine. Carl dropped to one knee, as if his legs had simply stopped supporting his weight, his head bowing in a gesture that looked almost penitent. "Ma'am, I didn't... Flynn had already backed away from the group entirely, disappearing toward the equipment shed, the saboteur recognizing that his presence was no longer welcome anywhere in the vicinity of what was unfolding. Captain Forrester's eyes were locked on his phone screen, where he'd pulled up the database entry again, scrolling frantically through information he'd skimmed past the first time. His face reflected the growing horror of someone realizing they'd massively, catastrophically misjudged a situation. Connor Blake's slow smile emerged like sunrise, knowing and vindicated and proud all at once. His own salute snapped up sharply, held with the particular respect of one scout sniper for another. "I knew it," he said softly, though his voice carried across the stunned silence. "Ghost Unit 7, you're a legend." Paul continued recording, his hands shaking enough that the footage would be unwatchable, but his voice provided narration through the shock. This is Sergeant Hazel Blackwood. Holy cow, this is actually happening." Charlotte stepped forward, her lieutenant's bearing finally showing something beyond professional neutrality. Genuine respect tinged with awe. Her salute was crisp, proper, held with the gravitas the moment deserved. "It's an honor, Sergeant." And then, as if a dam had broken, the entire range erupted into motion. 15 Marines who'd been watching the confrontation suddenly snapped to attention simultaneously, a wall of salutes so perfectly synchronized it could have been choreographed. The sound of boots coming together, of hands striking brows, of collective respect manifesting in physical form, it rolled across the range like thunder. Hazel stood at the center of this transformation, her torn cardigan hanging off one shoulder, the hog's tooth tattoo fully visible, her expression still neutral but perhaps carrying the faintest suggestion of something, resignation maybe, or the particular weariness of someone whose carefully maintained privacy had just shattered completely. Captain Forrester's phone screen updated with the full database entry, information that had been truncated in his initial quick search now displaying in complete detail: Blackwood, Hazel Marie, rank, Sergeant, USMC MOS 031 Scene, Scout, Sniper, School, Graduate, Class 111, 2011, Deployments, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, 2013 to 2014, Combat Actions, Classified, Confirmed Kills, Multiple, Exact Number, Classified, Longest Recorded Shot, 1,410 yards, Commendations, Navy Cross, Recommended, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon. Status, Medical Discharge, 2014 Discharge. Type, Honorable Reason, PTSD, Combat-Related Current Assignment, Administrative Assistant, Base Operations Office, Quantico. Forrester read the information aloud, his voice shaking with each line, the words painting a picture that transformed everything they'd believed about the small woman in the cardigan. When he reached the recorded shot distance, 1,410 yards, several Marines gasped audibly. "Current base record holder," Forrester continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "For 10 years. The shot everyone's been trying to beat. She's the one who said it." Master Gunny Oswald's salute finally came down, but his attention never left Hazel. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough texture of emotion, barely contained. "Sergeant Blackwood saved my nephew's platoon during the Fallujah offensive. 3 targets, 1,000 meters, while under active fire from multiple positions. She was 19 years old. The number hung in the air, 19. Barely old enough to legally drink, facing combat situations that would break adults twice her age." Oswald continued, his words coming faster now, as memory reasserted itself fully. "She was the youngest female scout sniper in Marine Corps history, completed the school on her first attempt when the washout rate was 87%. Made shots that people still talk about in briefings, though they don't usually mention her name because most of her work was classified." Lily had dissolved into tears, her young face reflecting something like devastation mixed with wonder. She looked at Hazel the way someone might look at a miracle, or perhaps at proof that the impossible wasn't quite as impossible as they'd been told. Bradley stood frozen, watching this revelation unfold with an expression that suggested his entire conception of reality was being forcibly rewritten in real time. And Hazel, standing at the center of this maelstrom of recognition and respect, finally spoke. Her voice remained quiet, steady, carrying the particular calm of someone who had learned to function under pressures that would shatter most people. "That shot just now?" She gestured toward the distant target with her chin. 1,425 yards, 18-mile-per-hour crosswind. I broke my own record. The power reversal was complete. The underdog had been revealed not just as competent, not merely as skilled, but as legendary. The woman they'd dismissed as a curious civilian had turned out to be someone whose name appeared in training manuals, whose achievements set standards others measured themselves against. Everything they'd believed about her, every assumption, every condescending dismissal, every mocking laugh, had been catastrophically, humiliatingly wrong. And she'd let them believe it, right up until the moment when she couldn't anymore. The weight of revelation pressed down on the range like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Bradley Cassian remained frozen in place, his hand still extended in the space where Hazel's shoulder had been moments before, as if his body hadn't yet received the message that everything had changed. The confident sneer that had dominated his features for the past hour had evaporated, replaced by an expression that cycled rapidly through disbelief, comprehension, and finally something approaching genuine horror. "Sergeant," the word emerged from his throat like broken glass, rough and cutting. There's no excuse. I disrespected a superior officer. I disrespected someone who... He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't find words adequate to the magnitude of his error. Hazel adjusted her torn cardigan, pulling it back over her shoulder, with movements that were neither hurried nor particularly concerned. The hog's tooth tattoo disappeared beneath gray fabric again, but its revelation had already rewritten the entire morning. She looked at Bradley with eyes that held no anger, no vindication, just a kind of weary recognition that perhaps she'd seen this pattern play out before. "You disrespected someone you didn't know," Hazel said quietly, her voice carrying across the silence with perfect clarity. "That's the actual lesson here. Not that I turned out to be a scout sniper. The lesson is that you made assumptions about capability based on appearance, and those assumptions were wrong. Tomorrow it might be someone else you underestimate, someone who doesn't have a hog's tooth to prove their worth. Will you disrespect them too?" The question hung between them, philosophical and pointed simultaneously. Bradley's jaw worked silently, processing implications that extended far beyond this single morning's humiliation. Indra stepped forward, her earlier confident mockery having transformed into something that looked genuinely broken. Her hands twisted together at her waist, knuckles white with pressure. When she spoke, her voice cracked with emotion that seemed to surprise even her. "Ma'am, She stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. "I was judgmental and cruel. I said things that were disrespectful and unprofessional. I assumed I knew who you were based on nothing except how you looked, and I used that assumption to make myself feel superior." Tears continued tracking down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. "There's no excuse for how I treated you. I'm sorry, Sergeant." The apology was raw, unpolished, carrying the particular authenticity of someone confronting their own ugliness in real time. Hazel studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Not absolution exactly, but acknowledgement. Carl approached more slowly, his movements careful, as if approaching something sacred that might shatter under careless handling. He had maintained his kneeling position throughout the revelations, and when he finally stood, his posture carried a deference that hadn't existed 20 minutes earlier. "Sergeant Blackwood," Carl began, his instructor's confidence replaced by something approaching humility. "I believed I was an expert marksman. I've taught hundreds of Marines, qualified dozens of snipers, but watching you shoot..." He paused, searching for adequate words. "I would be honored if you'd be willing to teach me, to show me what real expertise actually looks like. I thought I knew, but clearly I was mistaken about a great many things." The admission cost him something. Ego, perhaps, or the comfortable certainty of his own competence. But he delivered it cleanly, without hedging or qualification. Hazel's expression softened fractionally, the first crack in her neutral facade. "You're a good instructor, Staff Sergeant. I watched how you checked that scope, how you analyzed wind conditions. You know your craft, but maybe there's room for both of us to learn from each other." The generosity in her response seemed to hit Carl harder than condemnation would have. He nodded, unable to speak past whatever emotion had lodged in his throat. Flynn Garnett materialized from behind the equipment shed where he'd retreated, his young face pale and set with determination that looked like it was costing him significant courage to maintain. He walked directly to Hazel, came to attention, and met her eyes with visible effort. "Sergeant, I sabotaged the scope windage before your first shots," Flynn said, the words emerging in a rush as if he needed to expel them before courage failed. "I adjusted it 3 clicks off because I wanted you to fail. I wanted everyone to laugh at you trying and missing." His voice dropped to barely above whisper. I'll accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate. I'll submit myself for formal disciplinary action. What I did was dishonorable." The confession hung in the air, raw and complete. Several Marines shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Flynn had just admitted to something that could result in serious consequences. Reduction in rank, extra duty, potentially even separation proceedings, depending on how far someone wanted to push it. Hazel regarded him with an expression that was difficult to read. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying that same quiet authority that had characterized all her interactions. "You'll write 5,000 words on why integrity matters in military service. You'll research and include examples of how small acts of sabotage have resulted in mission failures and loss of life. You will examine your own motivations for what you did this morning, and you'll propose specific steps for ensuring you never compromise your honor in this way again." She paused, letting the assignment settle. "You'll submit it to me at Base Operations Office 1 week from today." Dismissed. Flynn's eyes widened slightly. The punishment was significant but not career-ending, demanding real work and introspection without destroying his future. "Yes, Sergeant. Thank you, Sergeant." He saluted crisply, held it until Hazel returned the gesture, then executed an about-face and departed with his back ramrod straight. Captain Forrester had been standing slightly apart from the main group, his phone still clutched in his hand, his expression suggesting someone undergoing rapid recalculation of multiple assumptions simultaneously. Now he stepped forward with the measured pace of someone approaching a situation that required careful handling. "Sergeant Blackwood," Forrester began, his earlier dismissive authority replaced by something approaching deference. "I owe you a formal apology. I made assumptions about your presence here, about your capabilities, about your right to be on this range. Those assumptions were not only wrong, but disrespectful." He paused, seemed to gather himself. "I would like to formally invite you to apply for an instructor position within our advanced marksmanship program. We need someone with your level of expertise. We need someone who can teach not just the technical skills, but the discipline and humility that clearly accompany genuine mastery." The offer was substantial. Instructor positions were competitive, respected, and represented a significant step up from administrative work. Hazel studied Forrester's face, reading sincerity in the lines around his eyes. "I'll consider it, Captain," Hazel replied, non-committal but not dismissive. "I came back to Quantico for reasons that had nothing to do with shooting. Whether I'm ready to step back into that world full-time," she let the sentence trail into implication. Master Gunny Oswald had maintained his position throughout these exchanges, his weathered face reflecting emotions that decades of military bearing struggled to contain. Now he moved closer to Hazel, and when he spoke, his voice carried the rough texture of memory and respect intertwined. "Sergeant, I need to tell you something." Oswald's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, as if touching something beneath his uniform. "My nephew, Lance Corporal Thomas Ringy, he was part of 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company during the Fallujah offensive in 2014. They were pinned down in a building, taking fire from 3 different positions. Reinforcements were 20 minutes out. They had wounded who couldn't be moved." The story emerged with the careful precision of someone recounting events they'd heard, described many times, events significant enough to be memorized in detail. A scout sniper team was operating in the area. They repositioned under fire, established a hide site on a rooftop 1,200 meters from the nearest target, and over the course of 18 minutes, that team eliminated all 3 enemy positions with surgical precision. My nephew said they never heard the shots, just watched the enemy fire stop, position by position, like someone was flipping switches. Oswald's eyes glistened with moisture that hadn't quite become tears. "Thomas told me the spotter's name. Said he'd never forget it as long as he lived, because that Marine saved his entire platoon. Sergeant Hazel Blackwood. The name was delivered with the reverence usually reserved for prayers. You were 19 years old. You'd been in country for 8 weeks. The information settled over the assembled Marines like revelation, context transforming what they'd witnessed from impressive to mythical. 19 years old, in combat for 8 weeks, making shots that saved lives under conditions that would break most people. I write recommendation letters maybe twice a year, Oswald continued, for Marines who demonstrate something exceptional, something that deserves recognition beyond their immediate chain of command. I'll write one for you tonight, Sergeant, for your instructor application, and I'll make sure the chain of command understands exactly what happened here today. Not just your shooting, but how you handled people who treated you poorly. That takes a different kind of strength. Hazel's neutral expression finally cracked, emotion flickering across her features before being brought back under control. Your nephew is a good Marine, Master Gunny. I'm glad he made it home. Connor Blake had been standing slightly apart, his earlier vindication having settled into something more contemplative. Now he approached with the easy confidence of someone who had already been proven right, but didn't feel the need to rub it in. Ghost Unit 7 is rebuilding, Connor said without preamble. They're looking for instructors with combat experience, people who can teach the next generation, not just from manuals, but from real-world application. I have contacts in the program. If you wanted back in that world. He let the offer hang, recognizing that pushing would be counterproductive. Hazel nodded acknowledgement, but didn't commit to anything. Appreciate it, Corporal. It's good to see you, Sergeant, Connor added, his voice dropping slightly so the words were more private. We don't have enough women in scout sniper roles. The ones who make it through tend to be exceptional, but the path is harder than it should be. Having someone like you in an instructor position could change that trajectory. The observation was astute, touching on institutional dynamics that everyone recognized but few discussed openly. Hazel's slight smile suggested she appreciated both the observation and the discretion in how it was delivered. Lieutenant Charlotte Erica had maintained her position of professional observation throughout most of the confrontations and revelations, but now she moved forward with purpose, her officer's bearing carrying authority softened by genuine respect. Sergeant, I want to apologize on behalf of everyone here for how long it took to de-escalate the situation, Charlotte said formally. I should have intervened more forcefully when Bradley became aggressive. That's on me as the ranking officer present. She paused, then continued in a tone that was slightly less formal. But I also want to say that your composure under what amounted to sustained harassment was remarkable. You never lost your temper, never pulled rank, never demanded the respect you'd clearly earned. That level of discipline is instructional in itself. Sometimes the most powerful response is just letting people reveal themselves, Hazel replied quietly. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson, I just wanted to shoot. The simple honesty of the statement somehow made it more profound. She hadn't orchestrated this morning's events for dramatic effect or to humble arrogant Marines. She had simply wanted to engage in an activity that once gave her purpose, and the revelation had been forced by circumstance rather than planned for effect. Lily Grace had been hovering at the edge of the group, her young face still showing tear tracks, her entire body language suggesting someone experiencing something transformative. Now, she gathered her courage and approached Hazel with the tentative steps of someone approaching something precious. Ma'am, Lily began, her voice still thick with emotion, I've been trying to qualify for Scout Sniper School. I've taken the screening test twice and failed both times. Everyone keeps telling me that women don't have the physical capability, that the standards are too high, that maybe I should focus on other specialties. She stopped, swallowed hard. Seeing you today, knowing that you're real, that you succeeded, ma'am, would you consider mentoring me, teaching me what I need to know to make it through the program? The request was delivered with desperate hope, the kind of plea that suggested Lily had been carrying this dream for a long time, against steady resistance from multiple directions. Hazel studied the young Marine, seeing perhaps some echo of her own younger self in that earnest determination. For the first time that morning, Hazel's smile reached her eyes, not broad, but genuine, carrying warmth that transformed her entire presence. Call me when you're ready to commit to the work, Hazel said, her tone serious but not discouraging. Scout Sniper School isn't just about shooting. It's about mental endurance, physical resilience, and psychological fortitude under conditions designed to break you. If you're willing to put in the preparation, I'll help you get ready. But you need to understand, I won't make it easy because the school won't be easy. Fair? Yes, ma'am. Lily's response came out almost as a shout, enthusiasm overriding military bearing. She caught herself, moderated her volume. I mean, yes, Sergeant, thank you. You won't regret this. Make sure you don't regret it, Hazel replied, but the words carried encouragement rather than warning. Paul Raymond had continued recording throughout most of these exchanges, his phone capturing footage that would indeed, as he'd predicted, go viral within the Quantico Marine community within hours. Now he lowered the device, his expression thoughtful. Sergeant, this video is going to spread, Paul said matter-of-factly. By this afternoon, everyone on base will know this story. By tomorrow, it'll probably be on Marine social media groups. Just wanted to give you a heads up in case you wanted to." He gestured vaguely, suggesting damage control or privacy requests. Hazel considered this, then shrugged slightly. Can't control what people share. If the story inspires someone or makes people think twice about assumptions, that's fine. If it just becomes entertainment, that's fine too. I stopped worrying about my reputation in 2014. The statement carried implications about trauma and survival that none of them quite knew how to address directly. The reference to 2014, the year of her medical discharge, the year something happened that ended her active service, hung in the air like smoke. For military personnel and veterans transitioning to civilian life, specialized insurance coverage addresses unique needs that standard policies often overlook. Combat-related PTSD treatment, service-connected disability benefits coordination, and deployment gap coverage ensure comprehensive protection during career transitions. Many providers now offer policies specifically designed for former special operations personnel, covering everything from firearms liability to professional consultation work. Veterans re-entering specialized fields should explore insurance packages that recognize their unique risk profiles and provide coverage tailored to their skill sets and employment situations in high-stakes professional environments. Chief Warrant Officer Albert Anderson emerged from the Armory building, his 48 years evident in both his graying hair and the deliberate pace of someone who'd learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes. He carried a maintenance log in one hand, his expression suggesting he'd been monitoring the situation from a distance and had waited for an appropriate moment to involve himself. "Sergeant Blackwood," Albert called out as he approached, "I've reviewed the equipment logs. The M40A6 you used was checked out under my authority to Sergeant Cassian this morning. The Barrett M82 was likewise properly documented." He glanced at Flynn's retreating form. "The scope tampering you corrected wasn't noted in any official documentation, which means it happened after the equipment cleared my inspection. Just wanted you to know that my armory provided properly maintained gear. Whatever happened after that wasn't on my watch." The statement was delivered with professional pride, making clear that Anderson's standards remained intact, regardless of how others might have compromised them afterward. Hazel nodded appreciation for the clarification. "Your equipment was flawless, Chief. Made the shooting considerably easier." Anderson's weathered face creased into something approaching a smile. "Glad to hear it, Sergeant. And for what it's worth, watching you work reminded me why I maintain these weapons to the standards I do. It's one thing to keep gear functional, it's another to see it used by someone who understands what proper maintenance enables. That was educational." The exchange was brief, but carried the mutual respect of professionals who recognize competence in each other. Anderson departed with a casual salute, returning to his armory with the satisfied air of someone whose worldview had been validated rather than challenged. Sergeant First Class Audrey Bellatrix had been standing near the range entrance throughout the latter portion of the confrontation, her military police bearing making clear that she was present in an official capacity rather than as casual observer. Now, she approached with her patrol notebook in hand, her expression neutral in the way of law enforcement personnel documenting an incident. "Sergeant Blackwood, I need to gather some information for my report," Audrey said formally. "Lance Corporal Garnett has confessed to equipment tampering, which constitutes a violation of Article 92 under UCMJ, dereliction of duty. Additionally, Sergeant Cassian's physical contact with you could be construed as Article 128, assault, depending on whether you wish to press charges." She paused, pen poised over paper. "How would you like me to document this incident?" The question was delivered professionally, but it carried significant weight. How Hazel responded would determine whether this morning resulted in formal disciplinary action, potential courts-martial, or simply became another story in the ongoing narrative of military life. Hazel considered the question with visible care, her expression suggesting she understood the implications of various responses. "Lance Corporal Garnett has been assigned corrective action by me directly. I consider that matter resolved unless his chain of command determines otherwise. As for Sergeant Cassian," she glanced at Bradley, who stood rigid with barely contained dread. "The physical contact was inappropriate but not malicious. He was frustrated and made a poor decision in the heat of the moment. I don't believe formal charges serve anyone's interests here." Bradley's exhale was audible, relief and shame mixing in equal measure on his face. Audrey nodded, making notes in her patrol book with economical efficiency. Understood, Sergeant. I'll document the incident as a training confrontation that escalated due to miscommunication and was resolved through appropriate corrective action at the lowest level. That keeps it out of formal proceedings while maintaining a record should similar issues arise in the future. The phrasing was precise, creating documentation that would protect everyone involved while avoiding the career-damaging consequences of official disciplinary action. It was the kind of solution that experienced NCOs learned to craft, tough enough to mean something, gentle enough to allow recovery. One more thing, Audrey added, her formal tone softening slightly. I watched most of what happened here, Sergeant. The way you handled people who were treating you poorly, that was professional development in action. If half the Marines on this base had your level of discipline and restraint, my job would be considerably easier. Hazel accepted the compliment with a slight nod, then adjusted her torn cardigan again, preparing to depart. But before she could move, Colonel Arthur Ambrose appeared at the range entrance, his 52 years and full bird rank making his presence immediately significant. The assembled Marines snapped to attention automatically, recognizing that senior leadership had arrived. "As you were," Colonel Ambrose said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He walked directly to Hazel, studying her with eyes that missed very little. "Sergeant Blackwood, I've just received a rather interesting phone call from Captain Forrester about an incident on this range. I thought I should see the situation myself." Hazel came to attention, her posture shifting from relaxed civilian to military bearing with seamless efficiency. "Sir, I've pulled your full service record," Ambrose continued, his tablet now visible in his hand. "Makes for compelling reading. Scout sniper, youngest female to complete the program, multiple combat deployments, Navy Cross recommendation that got downgraded to a combat action ribbon for classification reasons." He scrolled through information. "Medical discharge for combat-related PTSD after losing your entire spotter team in an IED ambush. Sole survivor of an incident that killed 3 other Marines." The information was delivered matter-of-factly, but its impact on the assembled Marines was visible. Sole survivor. The words carried implications about trauma and survivor's guilt that made Hazel's quiet demeanor suddenly more comprehensible. "You've been working in administrative support for 8 years, Ambrose continued. Exemplary performance reviews, but significantly underutilized given your actual capabilities. Why haven't you applied for instructor positions before now, Sergeant?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than criticism. Hazel met the colonel's gaze steadily, her expression suggesting she was deciding how much truth to share. "I wasn't ready, sir. Coming back to Quantico, being near the training environment without being active duty, that let me stay connected to the Corps while maintaining distance from the triggers that come with direct combat instruction. I needed that separation to heal." The honesty was stark, unadorned by military euphemism or warrior stoicism. Ambrose's expression softened incrementally, recognition passing across his features. "And now? Are you ready now?" Hazel glanced around the range, taking in the Marines who had underestimated her. The equipment she'd used to re-establish capabilities she'd spent years downplaying, the whole complicated morning that had forced her back into visibility. "I don't know yet, sir, but I'm considering it." Ambrose nodded, seeming satisfied with the response. "Fair enough. But I want you to know that, when you are ready, this base needs what you can offer. Not just your marksmanship skills, though those are obviously exceptional. We need your perspective, your experience, and frankly your example." He gestured toward Lily. "We have young Marines like Private Grace here who deserve mentors who can show them what's possible. That matters, Sergeant. That changes the institution." The appeal was skillfully delivered, not pressure exactly, but clear articulation of stakes that extended beyond individual choice. Hazel acknowledged it with a nod that committed to nothing, but recognized the validity of the argument. "Effective immediately," Ambrose continued, his tone shifting to command authority. "I'm ordering a policy review regarding how civilian personnel and veterans working in administrative roles are treated on this base. Too many people make assumptions based on current job title rather than full background. That changes now. Additionally, all personnel will receive training on appropriate conduct during range activities and formal protocols for challenging someone's presence or qualifications." The announcement was delivered loudly enough for everyone present to hear, making clear that today's events would have institutional consequences. Several Marines shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that they had contributed to a situation that was now prompting command-level intervention. "Captain Forrester," Ambrose called out, making the range officer straighten reflexively. "You'll coordinate with Staff Sergeant Fletcher to develop that training program. I want curriculum drafted within 2 weeks and implementation begun within 30 days. Clear?" "Yes, sir," Forrester responded crisply, his earlier dismissiveness having transformed into something approaching enthusiasm for the assignment. Perhaps he recognized an opportunity to turn his own failure into institutional improvement. Dr. Hugo Jasper had been observing from the civilian contractor area, his 60 years and extensive experience as a ballistics expert giving him perspective slightly removed from military hierarchy. Now he approached with a data tablet in hand, his expression carrying professional excitement. "Sergeant Blackwood, I need to confirm something for my records," Hugo said, his academic demeanor making the request feel more like collaboration than interrogation. "That final shot with the Barrett, I measured wind speed at the target end at 18.3 miles per hour, crosswind from the southwest. Distance to target was exactly 1,227 yards. The ballistic calculator suggests that shot should have required 7.2 minutes of angle windage compensation and 4.8 MOA elevation adjustment from your zero. Did you calculate those corrections manually?" The question was highly technical, asking whether Hazel had done complex mathematical calculations in her head or relied on practiced intuition developed over thousands of similar shots. Hazel considered her response carefully. "Mix of both, Doctor. At that distance with that wind, the math provides a starting point. But real-world shooting also requires reading mirage, feeling the environmental factors that don't show up in calculations, trusting experience more than equations. I adjusted based on what I was seeing and what similar conditions have taught me." Hugo's expression suggested this was exactly the answer he'd hoped to hear. "That shot will be officially logged in the base records. Longest confirmed hit on this range in 15 years of documentation. Congratulations, Sergeant. You've set a standard that will challenge shooters for the next decade." The validation from a civilian ballistics expert carried different weight than military recognition. Technical rather than hierarchical, based purely on measurable achievement rather than rank or status. Hazel accepted it with a nod of appreciation. Lance Corporal Dylan Kai had been standing quietly near the back of the group, his combat engineer background giving him particular context for the IED references that had emerged during discussions of Hazel's discharge. Now he spoke up, his voice carrying carefully controlled emotion. "Sergeant, I did 3 deployments as combat engineer in Helmand Province between 2012 and 2015. I know what IED threats were like in that area. The fact that you survived an ambush that killed 3 others," he paused, choosing words carefully, "that scar on your arm, burn pattern from explosive force. You were close to the blast, maybe too close." The observation was delivered with the particular knowledge of someone who'd seen similar injuries, who understood the mechanics of how explosives damaged human bodies. Hazel's hand moved unconsciously to her left forearm, touching the area where the scar remained hidden beneath her cardigan sleeve. "Close enough," Hazel confirmed quietly. "Close enough that I remember the heat before I remember the sound. Close enough that waking up afterward felt like cheating somehow because the others didn't get to wake up." The survivor's guilt was naked in those words, unfiltered and raw. Dylan nodded understanding, his own expression suggesting he carried similar burdens. "IED scars don't define who you are as a Marine," Dylan said firmly. "They prove you were there, that you faced the worst and came through it. But your capabilities, what you demonstrated today, those came from skill and dedication, not from what happened to you in combat. The trauma is real, but so is your expertise. Both can be true simultaneously." The philosophy was delivered with conviction, offering perspective that came from personal experience rather than theoretical understanding. Hazel's expression shifted slightly, acknowledging the validity of the observation, even if fully accepting it remained beyond her current capacity. Military veterans seeking to transition into instructor roles or specialized consulting positions often benefit from certification programs that formalize their combat experience into recognized credentials. Advanced marksmanship instructor courses, tactical training certifications, and specialized weapons handling qualifications can transform operational experience into marketable professional skills. Many accredited programs now offer accelerated pathways for individuals with documented combat experience, recognizing that real-world deployment provides education that classroom training cannot replicate. For those considering careers in law enforcement training, private security consultation, or military contract instruction, proper certification ensures both legal protection and professional credibility in competitive fields. The Marines began dispersing slowly, the intensity of the morning's events requiring time to process fully. Bradley approached Hazel one final time, his posture carrying none of his earlier aggressive confidence. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of bravado, leaving only genuine contrition. "Sergeant, I need you to understand something," Bradley said quietly. "What I did this morning, the mockery, the physical aggression, that wasn't about you specifically. That was about me feeling threatened by competence I didn't expect, by someone challenging assumptions I'd built my identity around. But that's my problem to fix, not your burden to carry." He paused, gathering himself for what came next. "Real warriors don't advertise. I understand that now. The most dangerous people in any room are usually the ones nobody notices until circumstances require them to act. You were never trying to prove anything. We forced you to reveal yourself because we couldn't handle our own insecurity." Bradley's jaw tightened. "I'm going to work on that. On being less threatened by capability that doesn't look how I expect it to look. Thank you for not destroying my career over my stupidity." The apology was comprehensive and seemingly genuine, touching on self-awareness that suggested real potential for growth. Hazel studied him for a long moment, then extended her hand. Bradley shook it with careful respect, the gesture marking transition from antagonist to humbled student. Indra approached more hesitantly, her earlier social dominance having evaporated completely. "Sergeant, I don't have Bradley's excuse of feeling threatened. I was just mean. I used my position in the social hierarchy here to make myself feel important by making you feel small. That's inexcusable." Her voice cracked slightly. "I tell myself I'm a professional, that I respect the corps and everyone in it, but today I proved that was a lie. I only respected people who fit my narrow definition of what Marines should look like." The confession was brutal in its honesty, acknowledging ugly truths about prejudice and assumption. Hazel nodded acknowledgement, though her expression suggested forgiveness would require more than a single apology. "Actions matter more than words, Corporal. Show me who you are through how you treat the next person who doesn't fit your expectations." Carl simply clasped Hazel's hand briefly, his earlier verbal apology apparently exhausting his capacity for emotional expression. But his grip was firm, his eyes clear, and the respect in his bearing spoke volumes that words couldn't improve upon. As the Marines finally began departing the range for real, returning to their regular duties with the morning's events requiring mental processing time, Hazel found herself standing near the firing line, with only Master Gunny Oswald remaining nearby. The older man studied her with expression that mixed respect, concern, and something approaching paternal care. "You going to be okay, Sergeant?" Oswald asked quietly. "This morning pushed you back into visibility you had been avoiding. That couldn't have been easy." Hazel looked out across the range, watching wind flags flutter in the autumn breeze, seeing the distant targets that had become the stage for her forced revelation. "I came here this morning to test myself, to see if I still had the fire, if the skills had atrophied during 8 years of deliberately not using them. I got my answer." And what was the answer? The skills are still there. Muscle memory doesn't forget, even when you want it to. She paused, her expression distant. "But whether I'm ready to step back into that world full-time, to take on instructor roles and mentorship responsibilities, I don't know yet. The trauma is real. The survivor's guilt is real. Being around active-duty snipers might trigger things I've spent years learning to manage." Oswald nodded understanding. "Nobody's rushing you, Sergeant, but when you are ready, know that you'd be making a difference. Not just teaching marksmanship, but showing young Marines, especially young women like Private Grace, what's possible. That representation matters more than you might realize." "Maybe," Hazel conceded. "Or maybe I serve better by being the administrative assistant who occasionally reminds people not to make assumptions." Different kind of representation. The philosophy carried validity, suggesting that visibility didn't require returning to active shooting roles. Sometimes the most powerful statement was simply existing in spaces where people didn't expect to find you. Hazel began walking toward the range exit, ready to return to her office and the paperwork that had been waiting for her during this extended lunch break. But as she reached the gate, Paul jogged up behind her, slightly out of breath. "Sergeant, one more thing," Paul said, holding up his phone. I've already got requests from 3 different Marine social media groups asking if they can share the footage I recorded. What should I tell them? Hazel considered this, recognizing that she'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. The story would spread regardless of whether she sanctioned it. Better to embrace the narrative than fight futility. Share it with context, Hazel replied. Make sure people understand this wasn't about humiliating anyone or seeking revenge. It was about checking assumptions and recognizing that capability doesn't always announce itself. If people take away the lesson that they should treat everyone with respect until proven otherwise, that's useful. If they just want entertainment, well, at least it's entertaining. Paul grinned, already composing what was probably going to become the most viewed video in Quantico Marine's social media history. Copy that, Sergeant, and for what it's worth, watching you work today was an honor. Hazel departed the range finally, walking across the base grounds toward the base operations building, where her desk waited with its familiar stacks of administrative forms and routine correspondence. But the walk felt different now, as if the morning's events had shifted something fundamental in how she moved through the world. Marines she passed offered salutes, more than she'd received in years of working administrative roles, as if word had already begun spreading about what happened on the range. She returned each salute with practiced precision, accepting the recognition while recognizing that it came with complications she'd spent nearly a decade avoiding. Back at her office, Hazel settled into her desk chair and stared at the computer screen displaying her email inbox. 273 unread messages, most routine, some requiring action but none particularly urgent. The mundane reality of administrative work, comfortable in its lack of dramatic intensity. Her left shoulder still showed the tear in her cardigan where Bradley's grab had exposed the hog's tooth tattoo. She'd need to change into the spare blouse she kept in her desk drawer, repair or replace the sweater, return to the camouflage of normalcy that had protected her for so long. But first, she allowed herself a moment to simply sit with what had happened. The morning had been chaotic, uncomfortable, and ultimately revealing in ways she hadn't anticipated. But it had also proven something she'd needed to know. The skills remained, the capability endured, the fire hadn't been entirely extinguished by trauma and time. Whether that knowledge changed anything remained to be determined. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen, expecting routine work communication. Instead, the message came from an unfamiliar number with no caller ID, just a series of digits that suggested government routing. The message was brief. Sergeant Blackwood, please call this number at your earliest convenience. Time-sensitive consultation request. Classification level TS-SCI. Top secret, sensitive compartmented information. The highest standard classification level, reserved for operations and intelligence that could cause grave damage to national security if disclosed. Hazel stared at the message for several seconds, her pulse accelerating despite her best efforts to maintain composure. TS-SCI requests didn't come to administrative assistants. They came to active duty personnel with specialized capabilities and appropriate security clearances. They came to scout snipers. She copied the number into her phone's dial pad, her finger hovering over the call button, while her mind raced through implications. This morning she'd tested whether her skills remained intact. Now, within hours, someone was apparently interested in employing those skills. Coincidence? Or had her performance on the range been observed by people with resources to know such things? Hazel pressed the call button. The line rang once before connecting, the click of a secured line engaging audible, even before anyone spoke. Sergeant Blackwood, a male voice said. Neutral accent, professional tone, no identifying information offered. Thank you for calling promptly. I represent a Joint Special Operations Task Force operating under classified parameters. We have a situation that requires your particular skill set. I'm administratively assigned, Hazel replied carefully. I don't maintain active operational status. We're aware of your current assignment. We're also aware of your performance at Quantico Range 17 this morning. 1,425 yards, 18-mile-per-hour crosswind, first shot hit with Barrett M82. That level of capability suggests your skills remain operational, ready despite your administrative duties. The information about her morning shooting performance confirmed that someone had been watching, documenting, assessing. Hazel felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with temperature. What situation? She asked, keeping her voice level despite growing unease. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. High-value target, extreme range requirement, approximately 1,800 meters under adverse conditions. Mission parameters include 72-hour deployment window and uncertain extraction timeline. The voice paused deliberately. This is not a recruitment call, Sergeant. This is a recall. Your unique combination of capabilities and previous operational experience in the region make you specifically suited for this mission. 1,800 meters, nearly 2,000 yards. At the absolute edge of what even the most skilled marksman could reliably achieve, requiring perfect conditions, flawless equipment, and extraordinary shooter capability. I'm not active duty, Hazel said, though her objection was already weakening. I don't have current deployment clearances. I haven't maintained combat readiness standards. All administrative barriers can be addressed within 24 hours, the voice replied smoothly. Medical clearance, security credentials, equipment issue, we can expedite everything necessary to get you operational. The question isn't whether you can deploy, the question is whether you will. Hazel's hand tightened on the phone. 8 years she'd spent carefully constructing a life insulated from this kind of request, deliberately staying below the radar that attracted operational attention. One morning on the range, and that insulation had evaporated like morning fog. You mentioned previous operational experience in the region, Hazel said slowly, picking up on the specific phrasing. Why would that matter for current operations? The pause on the other end suggested careful consideration of what information could be shared over secured line versus what required face-to-face briefing. Your spotter team from 2014, the voice finally said. One member survived the IED ambush. He's been operating classified assignments for the past 8 years under deep cover status. He's currently embedded in the target area, and he specifically requested you for this operation. He believes the rapport you established during your previous deployment gives this mission higher probability of success. The words hit Hazel like physical impact, driving air from her lungs. Survivor. One of her team had survived. For 8 years, she'd carried the weight of being sole survivor, the guilt of living when 3 others died. And now someone was telling her that survival count had been wrong. Who? The word emerged barely above whisper. Which one survived? That information requires in-person briefing at classified facility. If you're willing to hear the full mission parameters, transportation can arrive at Quantico within 2 hours to bring you to the briefing location. Hazel stood from her desk chair, moving to the window overlooking the base grounds. Outside, Marines went about their daily duties, training, working, living the structured military life that she'd maintained connection to while avoiding full immersion. This morning, she'd tested her skills and found them intact. Now someone was offering her a chance to use those skills in service of something that mattered, alongside someone she'd believed dead for nearly a decade. The safe choice was obvious: decline, maintain the comfortable administrative existence, avoid the trauma triggers that combat deployment would inevitably activate, keep the wounds managed rather than risk tearing them open again. But safe wasn't always right, and sometimes the wounds couldn't truly heal until you faced them directly. When do I leave? Hazel asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. Transportation arrives in 90 minutes. Pack for 72 hours minimum, possibly extending to 2 weeks depending on operational developments. Bring nothing that can't be explained or abandoned if necessary. Brief your supervisor that you've been recalled for classified consultation. The official paperwork will follow through appropriate channels. The instructions were delivered with military efficiency, confirming that this operation had resources and authority backing it. Hazel's mind was already cataloging what she'd need: minimal personal items, appropriate clothing, the few possessions that had traveled with her through previous deployments. One more question, Hazel said before the call could disconnect. The target. Who are we eliminating? Another pause, longer this time. The man who planned the IED ambush that killed most of your team. He's been operating in the region for the past 8 years, continuing to orchestrate attacks against American and Allied forces. Intelligence finally located him. Your surviving teammate believes you have the right to be part of finishing what started in 2014. Justice, closure, revenge. The motivations tangled together in ways that Hazel couldn't immediately separate. But underneath the complexity, a simple truth emerged. Someone she'd believed dead was alive and specifically asking for her help. That connection transcended questions of wisdom or safety. 90 minutes, Hazel confirmed. I'll be ready. The call disconnected, leaving her standing at the window with phone still pressed to her ear, staring at Marines training in the distance, while her entire reality reorganized itself around new information. One of her team had survived. Someone she'd mourned for 8 years was alive. And now they were going back to Afghanistan together, to close a chapter that should have ended in 2014, but had instead remained painfully open. Hazel turned from the window and began making preparations, her movements automatic, muscle memory taking over, while her conscious mind processed implications she didn't have time to fully examine. She drafted a brief email to her supervisor, explaining she'd been recalled for classified consultation and would be unavailable for indeterminate period. She pulled her go-bag from the office closet, maintained despite years of not using it, containing the essentials needed for rapid deployment. She changed out of her torn cardigan into the spare blouse, transforming from the woman who had been revealed this morning back into the camouflage of administrative normalcy. But the transformation felt hollow now, protective coloring that no longer served its purpose. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from Lily Grace. "Thank you for today, Sergeant. You changed my life. I'll make you proud." Hazel stared at the message, recognizing that the morning's events had created ripples extending beyond her own situation. She'd become visible, become an example, become someone that young Marines would measure themselves against. That responsibility existed now, whether she wanted it or not. She typed a response. "Make yourself proud. That's what matters. We'll talk when I'm back." When, not if. Assumption of survival, even though the mission parameters suggested significant risk, but assuming death was self-fulfilling prophecy, and Hazel had survived too much to embrace fatalism now. 90 minutes. Time enough to prepare, not enough to overthink. Hazel shouldered her go-bag and departed the office, walking across Quantico base grounds one more time. But this walk carried different weight than her earlier departure from the range. Then, she'd been returning to administrative safety. Now, she was leaving that safety behind, stepping back into the operational world she'd spent 8 years avoiding. The wind picked up, carrying autumn scents and distant sounds of training exercises. Somewhere on base, Marines were learning skills they'd need for deployments that would test them in ways training could never fully prepare them for. She'd been one of those Marines once. Perhaps, in some ways, she'd never stopped being one. Hazel reached the base entrance where a civilian sedan waited, engine running, driver wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Government vehicle, probably intelligence agency, rather than military transport. She approached, verified the identification the driver offered, then climbed into the back seat. As the vehicle departed Quantico, Hazel looked back at the base that had been her refuge for 8 years. The place where she'd hidden in plain sight, maintaining connection to the core while avoiding the direct combat roles that might trigger unmanageable trauma. But hiding had expiration dates. Eventually, capability demanded expression. Eventually, the skills had to be used or they corroded from disuse, becoming sources of regret rather than foundations for purpose. This morning she'd proven the skills remained intact. Now she'd discover whether the person who wielded those skills had healed enough to return to the work that had once defined her. One of her team had survived. That knowledge changed everything, rewriting 8 years of grief and guilt into something more complex but perhaps more manageable. She wasn't sole survivor. She was one of 2. And together, they had unfinished business with the man who'd tried to kill them both. The sedan merged onto the highway, accelerating toward whatever classified facility held the full briefing and mission parameters. Hazel settled back into the seat, letting her mind enter the calm state she'd learned during scout sniper training. Not empty exactly, but focused, directed, ready. She'd asked herself this morning whether the fire still burned. The answer had been yes. Now she'd discover whether that fire could still forge something useful, or whether 8 years of dormancy had changed its fundamental nature. Either way, she was about to find out. The sedan disappeared into distance, carrying Sergeant Hazel Blackwood toward a future that looked nothing like the administrative safety she'd carefully constructed. Behind her, Quantico continued its daily routines, training, qualifying, preparing Marines for combat they might or might not face. But one Marine's preparation had just transformed from theoretical to immediate. The woman they'd underestimated this morning was about to remind the world why scout snipers earned their hog's-tooth tattoos through blood and excellence. Service doesn't seek recognition. It simply responds when called, and Hazel Blackwood had just answered the call.